All right, picture this. You wake up before dawn. It is freezing cold. Your boots have holes in them. Your stomach is growling like an angry dog. And somewhere out there, across a muddy field wrapped in fog, tens of thousands of men are getting ready to do something absolutely insane. March straight at each other, shoot, stab, and fight until one side breaks. Welcome to the Napoleonic Wars. And let me tell you something, friend. Dying fast on that battlefield? That was actually the lucky option. Does that send a chill right down your spine? Because it should. Today we are going to take a real hard look at what it meant to get wounded during the Napoleonic era. Not the glorified version you see in paintings, with noble soldiers dramatically clutching their chests while flags wave behind them. No, no, no. We are talking about the actual brutal, stomach-turning reality of military medicine, or more accurately, the terrifying lack of it, between roughly 1803 and 1815. And trust me, by the end of this, you are going to look at those fancy Napoleonic portraits in a whole new light. So buckle up. This one is going to be a wild ride. Let us start at the very beginning. Who were these guys getting shot at? When Napoleon Bonaparte was building his Grande Armée, which by the way, at its peak numbered well over 500,000 men, he was pulling soldiers from all corners of Europe. French conscripts, sure, but also Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutchmen, Spaniards. On the other side of things, you had the British Redcoats, the Austrian Imperial soldiers, Prussians, Russians. A massive multinational meat grinder, and everybody was invited. Now, most of these men were not exactly living the high life even before they got shot. The average soldier in a Napoleonic army came from poverty. He was used to hard work, rough conditions, and not much food. Sounds tough already, right? But here is the kicker. Once he stepped onto that battlefield, the real nightmare was not just the enemy. It was what came after the fighting stopped. Think about that for a second. The cannons go quiet. The smoke starts to clear. And all across that field, you have thousands of men lying there, wounded, screaming, praying for someone to come help them. Does that not just hit you somewhere deep? That image alone tells you everything you need to know about why we are here today. Now let us talk about the weapons, because to understand the wounds, you have to understand what was causing them. The big dog on the Napoleonic battlefield was the musket, specifically the flintlock musket, weapons like the French Charleville or the British Brown Bess. These were single-shot, muzzle-loading firearms that a well-trained soldier could fire maybe 3 or 4 times per minute. They were not terribly accurate beyond about 50 yards. But here is the thing. Accuracy barely mattered when you were firing in massive formation volleys at close range. Thousands of musket balls flying through the air at once? Something was going to hit somebody. And those musket balls were not small. We are talking lead balls roughly 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Heavy. Slow by modern standards. But absolutely devastating to the human body. When a musket ball hit you, it did not just punch a clean hole through. It shattered bone. It tore through muscle. It carried dirty cloth fibers and debris deep into the wound. What does your gut tell you happens when something like that hits your leg? Yeah, it is not pretty. Then you had artillery, cannons firing solid iron balls, explosive shells, and the absolute horror show known as canister shot. Basically a tin can packed with smaller iron balls that turned the cannon into a giant shotgun. Getting hit by canister at close range was, well, let us just say the results were catastrophic and leave it at that. And then there were the cavalry charges, sabers, lances, hooves. Getting trampled or slashed by a cavalry sword meant ugly, jagged wounds that were almost impossible to clean properly. Man, this is heavy stuff. But hang in there, because the story of how people tried to deal with all this is just as fascinating as it is shocking. So the battle is over. You are lying there on the field. What happens next? In theory, there were supposed to be people coming to help you. The French army under Napoleon actually had a pretty organized system, at least by the standards of the time, thanks largely to one man. His name was Dominique Jean Leray, and honestly, calling him a pioneer is an understatement. The guy was a genius who genuinely cared about saving lives at a time when most military commanders saw the wounded as a logistical problem rather than human beings worth saving. Larry invented what he called ambulances volantes, flying ambulances. These were not vehicles in the modern sense. They were horse-drawn carriages specifically designed to move quickly on the battlefield, pick up wounded soldiers, and get them to a field dressing station as fast as possible. Before Larry, you might lay on that field for hours, maybe a full day, before anyone even looked at you. Larry changed that. He pushed the idea that the faster you treated a wound, the better the chance of survival. And he was absolutely right. Now, does this sound impressive? It was, for its time. But here comes the gut punch. What exactly were these flying ambulances delivering you to? The field hospital. Oh boy, where do we even start? Picture a church, a barn, a farmhouse, any building big enough to hold a crowd. That is your hospital. The floors are dirt or rough stone. The lighting is whatever candles or oil lamps could be scraped together. The surgical tables are often just doors taken off their hinges and laid across barrels. And the smell. Well, let us just say you would smell it before you saw it, and you would not soon forget it. The surgeons, and I use that term loosely, because in many armies the distinction between a surgeon and a butcher was mostly a matter of paperwork, were working under conditions that would make any modern doctor pass out cold. No antiseptics, no anesthesia in any reliable form, no understanding of germ theory whatsoever. The great Louis Pasteur would not come along for another several decades, and nobody on that bloody operating table knew that invisible microscopic things called bacteria were about to turn a survivable wound into a slow and miserable ordeal. What did they have? Rum, brandy, opium if they were lucky. Biting on a stick or a leather strap was not just a cliché. It was real. Patients were sometimes held down by several strong men while the surgeon worked. Speed was everything, not because it was better medicine, but because the faster you cut, the less the patient suffered, and the less likely they were to go into shock and not wake up. Does your skin crawl a little thinking about being strapped to that table? Mine too, friend. Mine too. Let us talk about the big one. The procedure that defined Napoleonic military medicine more than anything else. Amputation. Say the word slowly. Amputation. Because in the early 1800s, that word meant everything. A musket ball hits your knee and shatters it beyond repair? Amputation. Your arm catches a cannonball fragment and the bone is destroyed? Amputation. A saber slash on your thigh gets infected and starts going bad? Amputation. It was the Swiss Army knife of Napoleonic surgery, the answer to almost every serious limb wound. Now here is where it gets really wild. The great surgeons of the era were not just competent at this, some of them were breathtakingly fast. Robert Liston, a British surgeon a bit after the Napoleonic period, but working with the same techniques, was famous for amputating a leg in under 30 seconds. 30 seconds. The man moved so fast there are stories, probably exaggerated, but still told with great affection, of him accidentally amputating an assistant's fingers at the same time. Larry himself performed reportedly over 200 amputations in a single 24-hour period after a particularly brutal battle. 200. Let that sink in. One man, one day. 200 operations, each one done with handsaws, forceps, and a speed that bordered on supernatural. That man deserves about 15 history documentaries and a statue in every major city, no questions asked. But here is the dark side of all that surgical hustle. Even if the surgery itself went well, even if you did not pass out from pain and not wake up, even if the blood loss did not finish you right there on the table, you still had to survive what came after. And that, friend, was often the part that actually got you. Infection. The silent killer on every Napoleonic battlefield. The thing nobody understood and nobody could stop. When a surgeon finished an amputation, he would typically dress the wound with whatever was available. Bandages made from old linen. Sometimes lint, literally lint scraped from fabric, packed into the wound to absorb the bleeding. The surgical instruments were rinsed, maybe wiped on the surgeon's coat, and then used on the next patient. The same coat that had been worn through 6 hours of operating without being washed. Now we know today that this was basically painting every wound with bacteria. But in 1810, nobody knew that. They saw something called wound fever, what we now recognize as sepsis, as a natural part of the healing process. They called the pus that formed in infected wounds laudable pus, because they actually thought it meant the body was healing. They praised it. They saw it as a good sign. Does that not just make your jaw drop? The thing that was literally finishing their patients off, and they thought it was the body doing what it was supposed to do. Sometimes ignorance is genuinely terrifying, isn't it? Tetanus was another nightmare. Caused by bacteria thriving in the dirty soil of those battlefields, it would set in days after a wound and cause the muscles to seize up, locking the jaw, arching the back, causing convulsions. There was nothing anyone could do about it. Absolutely nothing. If tetanus got you, that was just about the end of the story. Gangrene was the third horseman. Without proper blood circulation and with bacteria running wild in torn tissue, gangrene, the literal rotting of living flesh, would set in. The smell was unmistakable. Surgeons could diagnose it from across a room. And the only treatment? More amputation. Cut higher. Get ahead of it. Hope for the best. Are you starting to see why getting wounded was sometimes worse than the alternative? Because the battlefield was brutal, yeah, but at least it was quick. The hospital could drag it out for days or weeks. Now, let us be fair here and give credit where it is due. Because not everything about Napoleonic medicine was pure chaos and suffering. There were genuine advances happening, even in those dark, candle-lit field hospitals. Larry, our guy, was far ahead of his time in several important ways. He developed techniques for triage, the practice of sorting the wounded by severity and treating the most critical cases first, regardless of rank. An ordinary soldier got the same attention as an officer. That sounds obvious today, but in the rigid class hierarchy of early 19th century Europe, that was revolutionary. Napoleon himself praised Larry as the most virtuous man he had ever known. High praise from a man who knew quite a few people. The understanding of wound care was also slowly, painfully improving. Some surgeons were starting to observe that wounds cleaned with water and kept dry seemed to do better than wounds left to fester. They did not know why. They just noticed the pattern. That kind of careful observation, even without the scientific theory behind it, was actually saving lives one small step at a time. Field surgery manuals were being written, circulated, improved. Medical education for military surgeons was getting more formalized. The British Army, in particular, had a strong tradition of training regimental surgeons who traveled with their units and knew the men they were treating. Personal connection, even in that chaos, made a difference. So is this all just doom and gloom? No. There were real heroes here, real people trying their absolute best with the tools they had. And that deserves respect, doesn't it? Let us zoom in on one particular battle to make all of this feel real. Because numbers and descriptions are one thing, but a specific day, a specific place, that hits different. Borodino, September 7th, 1812. The Grande Armée versus the Russian Imperial Army, about 70 miles west of Moscow. In a single day of fighting, roughly 70,000 men were killed or seriously wounded. 70,000 in one day. The field hospitals were overwhelmed within hours. Surgeons were operating by firelight because the sun had gone down and the wounded kept coming. Men waited for hours in lines, literal lines of wounded soldiers waiting their turn at the surgical table. Larry and his team worked through the night and into the following day without rest. The Russian surgeons on the other side were doing the same thing. Two armies, two sets of surgeons, all of them pushed beyond any reasonable human limit, trying to save men that both sides had been trying very hard to destroy just hours earlier. After Borodino, the sheer scale of the wounded created a logistics problem nobody had fully planned for. Moving thousands of seriously wounded men in horse-drawn carts across rutted roads in the early stages of a Russian autumn, because yes, Napoleon was already heading into that famous Russian winter disaster, was itself a cause of further suffering. Men with fresh amputations being jolted across rough terrain, wounds reopening, bandages that had not been changed in days. Does that not make you look at the whole idea of war differently? Not just the fighting, but everything that comes after the fighting stops? Let us also talk about the psychological side of things, because this is important and often gets overlooked. There was no concept of what we now call combat stress or trauma in any medical sense. Soldiers who came back from battle shaking, unable to sleep, flinching at loud noises. This was sometimes called soldier's heart, or simply dismissed as weakness or cowardice. Officers who showed these symptoms risked their reputations. Ordinary soldiers who showed them risked punishment. The idea that witnessing mass violence on that scale, participating in it, surviving it, that this would leave a permanent mark on a human mind, that concept was simply not available yet. It would take until after the American Civil War, and really not be properly addressed until the 20th century, for medicine to start understanding what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. So you had men who survived the battlefield, survived the amputation, survived the infection, made it home, and then spent the rest of their lives carrying something inside them that nobody around them had any language for. No framework to understand it, no treatment for it. just expected to go back to normal life, work the fields, raise a family, and never mention the things they saw. Does that not give you a real sense of respect for those men? Not just for their toughness, but for their silence, and everything that silence must have cost them? Now, here is something that often surprises people when they hear it for the first time. Survival rates for amputations in Napoleonic military hospitals varied wildly, but under good conditions, meaning a skilled surgeon, relatively quick operation, and some degree of luck with infection, were actually not terrible by pre-modern standards. Some estimates put survival rates for above-the-knee amputations in the range of 50 to 60%. For below the knee, even better. Compare that to, say, the medieval period, where a serious wound to a limb was essentially a death sentence, and you start to see why Larry's methods were genuinely considered a medical revolution at the time. The real killer remained what happened in the days following surgery, the hospital environment itself, the post-operative care, or lack of it. This is why so much of the death toll in Napoleonic campaigns came not from direct battlefield casualties, but from what the era called wound fever and disease in the hospitals and camps. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. These things tore through armies camped in close quarters with limited sanitation and no real understanding of how disease spread. In the Russian campaign of 1812 alone, historians estimate that Napoleon lost more men to disease and the effects of exposure and inadequate medical care than to direct Russian fire. That is a staggering thing to sit with, isn't it? The enemy's bullets were almost secondary to the environment and the microscopic world nobody knew existed. Let us bring this home. There is a reason that modern military medicine, with its trauma surgeons, helicopter medevac, antibiotics, blood transfusions, and field hospitals that would look like science fiction to a Napoleonic surgeon, has reduced battlefield mortality so dramatically compared to the early 19th century. Every single one of those advances was paid for, in some sense, by the suffering of men on fields like Borodino and Waterloo and Austerlitz. Larry watched men perish from things he could not yet name or explain. He improved what he could, he fought for his patients with everything he had, and he left behind writings that influenced military medicine for decades after his time. That is not a small thing. That is the slow, grinding, painful way that medical science actually moves forward. One catastrophe at a time, one dedicated person at a time. When you look at an AI recreation of a Napoleonic battlefield, when you see those orderly formations and the smoke and the dramatic cavalry charges, just remember what those images do not show. The hours after the guns went silent, the dark barns full of wounded men, the surgeons with their sleeves rolled up and their hands shaking from exhaustion, the soldiers who survived the fighting and then faced a different, quieter, longer battle just to stay alive. Does that hit you? It should, because those people were real, every single one of them. So there you have it, the full, ugly, complicated, and sometimes surprisingly heroic reality of what getting wounded in the Napoleonic Wars actually meant. No doctors in the modern sense, no medicine in the modern sense, just human beings doing the best they could in conditions that were genuinely terrifying, and occasionally, just occasionally, pulling off something that bordered on miraculous. If you made it all the way through this one, you are the real deal. Drop a comment down below. What part of this shocked you the most? Did you know about Larry before today? Because if you didn't, now you do. And honestly, that guy deserves way more fame than he gets. Hit that subscribe button, because we have got a lot more of this kind of deep, no-fluff history coming your way. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and be very glad you live in an era with antibiotics.